Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Tara Fickle, Assistant Professor of English at the University of Oregon. Fickle's interests include Asian American literature, game theory, 20th and 21st century American literature, ethnic literature, critical race theory, the digital humanities, graphic fiction, and children's literature. Fickle began teaching at the U of O in the fall of 2014 after earning her doctorate in English at UCLA. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So what led to your interest in literature, and specifically Asian American literature?
Well, I actually started college as a biochemistry major, so even though I was interested in English since high school, I don't think I ever thought about pursuing it as a career until I was probably a sophomore or junior at Wesleyan University, where I went to school. And initially I was planning to be a modernist. And it wasn't until after I did a year abroad in Shanghai that I really became interested in how these questions of culture and narrative and identity could be transnationally encoded in literature.
Your dissertation, Serious Play, Race, Game, Asian American Literature, examines some seemingly disparate topics. So race, games, and literature. Help us understand how those things go together in your work. In particular, I'm interested in the role that games play. Why games?
Yeah, well, the connection between literature and games is a pretty familiar one, particularly from a structuralist perspective, the idea that literature is a self-contained world, the world of the novel in particular, with its own sort of arbitrary self-contained rules and criteria for value. So in that sense, the connection between literature and games was one that almost felt somewhat a little bit played out by the time that I was looking at the topic. In terms of the Asian American and the race connection, that was initially a sort of fortuitous finding in a section from Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, where, just to sort of give you an example of how this sort of germinated, it's a passage in the novel where one of the Chinese immigrant mothers, whose daughter is a chess prodigy, but initially completely a novice at the game of chess and has no idea even how to play the game, is having a fight with her brother about whether she should be allowed to play because she doesn't know how any of the pieces work. And so the mother enters in to mediate the discussion by picking up the manual and saying, "Here, let me read it." So she looks at the instruction manual and she pretends to read it because she's illiterate. And after a few pages, she very smugly closes it and hands it back to the daughter and says, just as I suspected, these are American rules. In order to come to this country, you always have to know the rules. I'm not going to tell you what they say because you need to learn. That's part of being an American. And this idea of immigration and assimilation and being Asian American as being really intimately tied up with these structures of play that are extra legal in some sense, that are part of the law, but Baudrillard's idea of this is that when we choose the game law, the game rule, we're delivered from the law. And while I don't think it's always quite as clear as all that, the idea that there was something playful about what was being thought of as the Asian American experience seemed really important because it had so traditionally been understood from the perspective of labor, from racialized labor, from sort of a railroad onward perspective.
You, in your work, deploy game theory. What is that?
Well, I don't know how many economists are going to be watching this.
How do you understand it for your purposes?
Right. So the application of game theory is primarily located in the first chapter, which is a discussion about the Japanese-American internment. And it uses the idea of the prisoner's dilemma, which is in many ways a more colloquial understanding of economic and mathematical theories of games, to the idea of the paradox the Japanese Americans faced in terms of trying to declare their loyalty to the states just after Pearl Harbor, but also having government officials inherently feel unable to judge whether those statements were true or false. So what game theory means to me in that sense is what I understand it meant to John von Neumann and those who worked at the RAND Corporation on this topic after, which is that in real life, many situations resemble a game, not in the sense of being, chess was his example, not in the sense that there are just prescribed rules and moves and victories and losses, but that both observation and recursive observation feed into one's decision. So it's not simply what I think that you're going to do, it's also what I think you think I think I'm going to do. And those feedback loops become really interesting when you think about how race as something that is both indicative of an inscrutability and at once hypervisible are being created into the question of, sort of folded into that question of loyalty.
So some people criticize game theory's mechanisms and approaches being dehumanizing. It sounds like for you that is definitely not the case.
Yeah, it's an interesting myth that I think Jinshi Ling, who wrote Narrating Nationalisms, which is a really important book in Asian American literature, makes this point about how realism has been misunderstood similarly. And it's strange because even if you just go back to the original Morgenstern and von Neumann text, Morgenstern very explicitly says the whole point is that game theory relies on rationality, and rationality is the only thing that makes us human for many people, right? That's what distinguishes human from non-human. And so in order to assume that somebody can play a game rather than just sort of have frivolous, exuberant, spontaneous play is to assume a certain level of humanity.
So you not only apply in that opening chapter game theory to the historical case of Japanese-American internment, but you have developed an online game called Inside the Japanese-American Internment. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that actually came after I had developed a third chapter, which was looking at the mid to late 1970s as a time when fantasy tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons were just coming into vogue for the very first time in 1974, which was not coincidentally the same year that Tom Wolfe released his famous The Me Decade essay. But there was this whole obsession on the one hand with self-actualization as a kind of character inhabitation and role-playing. Yet Wolfe, despite his interest in all of the sort of stranger versions of self-actualization taking place, seems to just omit entirely the really seminal role of these fantasy tabletop games. And so in that chapter, I'm connecting what's going on in Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, which has very obvious, I think, and interesting connections to role-playing games. I mean, most obviously through the figure of the warrior. But after that, I was looking into the connections between those tabletop games and what are called game books, but most commonly known as choose your own adventure books, which were also taking off at the same time. And the idea there was the combination of literature and interactive game to create something that has been talked about as a cybertext or ergodic. And so my idea there was to see if the same thing might be productively done with an Asian American text, No No Boy, which far too few people may be familiar with, despite it being one of the most well-known in Asian American literature outside of the field.
Tell our audience the author of No No Boy so that they can go out and buy themselves a copy and read it.
John Okada.
So describe the game a little bit.
Yeah, so it's basically, it's sort of similar to Zork, that text-based game, except that instead of typing in responses, you click one of the responses. So it's similar to an online version of a choose your own adventure game. And what it does is it basically introduces the reader to the plot of No No Boy, but with a sort of combined identity with the narrator, Ichiro Suzuki, with Fred Korematsu, the well-known Supreme Court case surrounding Japanese-American internment. And it really is to emphasize the really branching number of choices, neither of which were satisfying for Japanese Americans from the beginning of Pearl Harbor to the decision to repatriate or to enlist or to stay in camp or to protest, in order to really highlight not only this really crucial part of history, but also to emphasize that as much as it seemed that choice was being utterly robbed in this situation through internment, that unfortunately it was actually these constant dilemmas which Japanese Americans still had to face on a daily basis.
And your player will experience the same choices. They'll have to make the same choices, I mean, in a virtual sense.
Absolutely, you know, on every level, like from things that seem tiny to those that seem large, you know, reporting or not reporting to a particular center, attending or not attending a protest or a lecture. Those are things that had reverberating consequences in ways that, especially for the youth there, couldn't necessarily be foreseen. So
you've given us a sense in this particular case of your use of new media, the internet, computers in your scholarly work. Among your areas of interest are the digital humanities. So first, can you give me a quick sense of how you define that term? I know it is a capacious and hard to define term, but for you, what is digital humanities?
I think digital humanities is really taking advantage of technology to, on the one hand, explore bodies of texts and ideas that would be computationally inefficient for a human being to do. For example, in the tradition of Moretti, doing something like analyzing an entire corpus of text and seeing how much of that can be both automated and also encoded in order to sort of detect patterns in text that otherwise wouldn't be recognizable. The second part of that is a real interest in the intersections between the digital humanities and race, which I think is a really fruitful but very untapped topic in the sense that how race is understood in relation to technology has always been a sort of 20th century trope, especially in terms of sort of techno-orientalism and this idea of the either sort of technologically superior or technologically inferior group. And so to think about how those connections might reveal something about both and also sort of inflect the study of race with even more interdisciplinarity.
I know you use the digital humanities in your classroom. Can you tell me about some of the things you've done with the digital humanities in your classes?
Well, it sounds like you know better than me.
Well, you showed me a game. You showed me a game.
The Ezra Pound one?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So in that, it's really about trying to engage with literature from a sort of atomic level. So in this, for example, breaking up in a 20th century literature class, the words of In the Station of the Metro into its component parts and treating them as if they were each a separate piece of a puzzle to demonstrate that the way that the words are put together is only one option of many, and a very intentional option, but one that has to be understood within a much broader context of interpretation. So I think that in even in basic ways, incorporating animation into presentations, incorporating various kinds of media, has really enhanced students' experience of it, both in terms of the metaphorical connection between literature and game, but also just sort of being able to visualize ideas.
Well, in this particular case, you described them just now as putting the words in the poem together as if they were puzzle pieces, but in the game they are literally on puzzle pieces.
Right, yeah, they're printed on puzzle pieces and they can be moved around, ideally tactilely, but just at this point with a mouse. And then having each group of students sort of come up with a different iteration and then comparing the effect of the overall.
How did you become involved in the digital humanities? How did you come to that? Where did you decide that that was going to be part of what you did as a scholar and as a teacher?
It's a good question. I have always been really interested in computer technology and also in games, especially video games. So just from a really young age, my dad really was interested in exposing us to computer games. So Zork was, I think, probably one of the first games that I played, and it fascinated and frustrated. but it was a fascinating idea about thinking machines and about machines that could play with you, which seemed the kind of ultimate pinnacle of intelligence. So in terms of my own work, though, I think I really got interested in it as a way of programming and visualizing. So taking Java classes and learning computer programming and thinking about that relationship of syntax and meaning as a narrative convention. And then also just really being interested in graphic design. So those all sort of converged and website design to sort of inflect the possibilities of my work.
You just mentioned that you're interested in graphic design. One of your areas of interest and expertise is graphic fiction, and I know you're currently teaching a course in graphic fiction. I will take the moment to say that the University of Oregon is the only institution in the country that has a comic studies minor, and the course that you're teaching is part of the minor. But tell me what's unique about Tara Fickle's approach to graphic fiction? You might think in terms of what are the texts, for example, that are on your syllabus in comparison to the text that might be on there.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder to what extent the experience of reading comics as literature, because it's within an English major, has been a sort of predominant approach. And what I've realized as we're entering into the second half of the quarter is that while this formal vocabulary of narrativizing, of closure, of structure have all been really useful ways to characterize the way comics works critically, I'm also realizing that avoiding comparison, too much comparison between literary and comic texts is really crucial to understanding how it's also participating in an explicitly and almost exclusively visual region. Things like advertisement, things like medical illustration, things like children's literature. And to be able to see the picture and the visual register as a primary vehicle of meaning that can be at times independent rather than codependent on the text is something that I'm really interested in exploring, and maybe something I haven't seen done as much elsewhere.
Interesting. I know that one of the big scholarly projects that you're working on is turning the dissertation into a book, but your interests are capacious. And I was wondering if there are other projects that you're interested in exploring or are currently pursuing that are on the sides of that major project.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually two projects, one of which ended up, I think I'm going to incorporate into the last chapter of the manuscript, which is about Chinese international students and these new sort of stereotypes of quote-unquote yellow peril in the idea of very wealthy Chinese students who are really making their presence felt, especially at places like the University of Oregon, and to think about how others and they are being affected by these stereotypes of leisure, in contrast to those that their ancestors tended to express completely in terms of labor. The other one that I'm thinking of, which is still really in a nascent stage, is to think about a sort of heavily archival approach to the shifts in the civics test aspect of the naturalization and immigration process, and how those tests have changed over the last century or so, and how they really reflect in a sort of 100-question format what the U.S. is sort of understanding as the most important parts of its history, the most important parts of its identity, and where it's sort of seeking to attract further immigration from. So, for example, looking at the most recent years of the civics test, a lot of things stay the same. So, how many stars and stripes are on the flag, or, what's the name of your local representative? But on the other hand, you can see a real intention to incorporate more recent things. So in addition to questions like what happened on September 11th, 2001 in the US, to which arguably there are many answers, but only one right one that they're looking for. Most recently, they have said list two of the two Native American tribes that are officially recognized in the US. And to think about what that experience is meant to reflect and suggest about what immigrants are expected to know, and whether we ourselves would consider that fair if we were to immigrate to another country and take similar tests, is, I think, a really interesting way to track changes in the cultural landscape over the 20th century.
That sounds completely fascinating. Where are those documents kept?
I've been trying to find the same thing. You can view the most recent iterations online as a study guide for the on the Department of Homeland Security page. But I've been really curious about where these earlier ones are. You know, all that I know about those earlier ones are from, you know, anecdotes from my family, and also in Asian American literature in the earlier part of the century, it's often dramatized as a very important moment where this interaction with the immigration official is a combination of this anxiety over these tests and the anxiety over the very specific questions that are meant to determine whether you're actually legally entering the way that you are saying you are.
Can you tell us what some of those texts are that you just alluded to?
Yeah. So Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior is probably the central one, where it focuses on the sort of ever narrower questions to determine in the earlier part of the century whether Chinese women were coming in legally, whether they were planning on having children, whether they were in fact prostitutes in disguise, as the page law claimed. And so the questions would be so minor as to say, you know, what year did your husband cut off his queue? Which would supposedly let them know exactly the last interaction that they'd had, whether there really was a private and personal relationship, or whether it was all sort of a sham for citizenship or a green card.
The project that you described, will that have this literary component to it?
I'm not sure. I'm just really curious right now about sort of getting a sense of what the changes are, but I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these new questions are drawing on potentially scenes from the literature, or at least interests in whatever literary movements were going on at the time.
So you're currently teaching this graphic fiction course. This is your first term at the University of Oregon. What are some of the courses that you are contemplating teaching in the near future?
Well, I'm particularly excited about a new media and culture course that I'm teaching in the spring, which is going to be about games and sort of critically analyzing games from multiple perspectives. For me, one of the most fascinating things about contemporary games, especially in the sort of the haptic age, is how these older models of games that were developed in the 30s and the 50s by people like Johann Huizinga or Roger Caillois apply or fail to apply to the particularities of tablet games in particular. So what I've been really interested in is the sudden rise of in-app purchases, which totally changes one's relationship to the game as something to either be, you know, paid for as a way of accelerating the game and therefore cheating, or some games are built such that those in-app purchases are required in order to even really be able to advance in the game. So the game is built in such a way that cannot be won by normal means, and how this really shifting this shifting economy of games is very different than, say, a game like Super Mario or earlier console games where you invested a lump sum in the game itself, and then you had access to all of its content. Now games are structured in a very different sort of modulated way of experiencing them in stages.
Very interesting. Do you also analyze really popular games that are, I ask because my son is a Minecraft fanatic, and I've become interested in the phenomenon of these YouTubers that are experts in the games. So my son plays the game and he spends a lot of time watching video of these YouTubers. Do you analyze in a course like that kind of phenomenon, or?
I definitely think I would like to. Even just in terms of questions of spectatorship, how watching sort of games of chess has always been sort of understood as inherently different than watching, say, a baseball game, right? That's often what sort of distinguished sport from game. But here, the idea that not only are you watching it not in real time, you're watching it from the sort of the privacy of your own home from a sort of second to third to fourth hand, however they filmed themselves playing. Yeah, it's amazing how these sort of minor celebrities really in the gaming community have arisen. And that's definitely something that I think a lot of our students would be interested in talking about too.
So you're here at the University of Oregon. What drew you to us?
Well, from a totally pragmatic standpoint, I am from Oregon, and so it was, luck beyond greatest expectation that this job opened up in Asian American literature. But I've also been really impressed by the university and the department's desire to really commit significant resources and a lot of thought into building the study of race, ethnicity, disability, environmental studies, all of these fields which are interests maybe at other schools, starting to gain a critical mass, but in which it's very clear that the university has put a substantial emphasis, and it's been really rewarding to feel part of that community.
Well, it's rewarding for us to have you here with us. My final question is about whether your scholarly life and your teaching life, how they intersect. So could you say something about whether something's happened in your classroom that has impacted your scholarship, or something that's happened in your scholarship that's impacted your teaching?
Absolutely. I mean, we're only in week 5, and I think by week 2, I was coming home saying, oh my gosh, I want to write on comics. I think I might change to become a professor who works on comics. This is so exciting. The students are so excited. They're seeing things in a single page that you could write an entire chapter on. And so I've really started to think more about how each subsequent class could be a springboard for really critical thought or critical projects, and it's been incredibly gratifying. I feel really lucky to have been able to teach this class my first quarter, especially here.
Well, that is a wonderful way to end our interview. Thank you so much, Tara, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Paul.
I've been speaking with Tara Fickle, a new faculty member in the Department of English at the University of Oregon. Join me next time when I speak with Juan Eduardo Wolf, Assistant Professor of Ethnomusicology at UO's School of Music and Dance. Thank you so much for watching.